The air was thick with tension as Detective Lila Harper entered the dimly lit office. The smell of old paper and burnt coffee hung in the air, mixing with the sense of unresolved mystery. She glanced at the photos strewn across the desk, images of the victim, the crime scene, and various suspects. Her fingers grazed a file marked with the victim's name, Jacob Graves. She could feel the weight of it all, but something about the case gnawed at her. The victim's life wasn't as straightforward as it seemed, and as Lila stared at the images, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a crime, but the beginning of something far darker. "I need to get to the truth," she whispered to herself, her eyes scanning the files, the room, and the world outside, as if the answers might be hidden in plain sight. The next day, Lila returned to the crime scene, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of traffic from miles away. She had learned one crucial detail. Jacob Graves was not a simple victim. His connections to the underworld ran deep. The warehouse, once a lively place of business, now stood as a haunting reminder of the world Jacob had left behind. Lila took careful steps, her boots echoing on the concrete floor. As she moved closer to the heart of the scene, the memories of those who had crossed this place lingered. She could almost hear whispers, warnings perhaps, or the voices of those who had come before her. Who would want him dead? Lila thought, surveying the room for any signs of struggle or hidden messages. Something wasn't adding up. Lila knelt down beside a broken crate in the corner, her fingers brushing against something strange, a small silver pendant. It was the kind of trinket you'd find in a jewelry box, but this one felt out of place here. Was it Jacob's? Maybe. Her mind raced with possibilities. She examined the pendant closely. It was engraved with a symbol she'd seen before, a symbol tied to an infamous gang known for their underground dealings. Was this a clue or just another red herring? She stood, feeling a sudden sense of urgency. The deeper she dug, the more complicated things became. And it was becoming clear that Jacob had been more than just a victim. He had been a player in something far larger than she had initially realized. The question now was, how deep did the rabbit hole go? Lila's investigation led her to an underground club, its neon lights flickering erratically as if trying to escape the darkness surrounding it. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, and the music vibrated the walls, but beneath the surface, something more sinister was at play. The bartender, a tall man with a rough exterior, eyed her warily as she approached. "I'm looking for information about Jacob Graves," she said, her voice steady but forceful. The bartender's expression faltered for just a moment before he turned away, as if he knew more than he was willing to share. The atmosphere in the club shifted. Whispers of Jacob's name spread like wildfire. As Lila pressed on, she couldn't help but feel that she was getting closer to the truth. A truth that would expose the dark heart of the city. As Lila stepped out of the club, the weight of the night's events settled heavily on her shoulders. The bartender had given her a cryptic warning. Some things are better left alone. But she couldn't turn back now. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make any sense. Jacob Graves, a low-level criminal, involved with a dangerous gang, yet there was more to him than met the eye. Lila felt a pull, as if the city itself was hiding something from her, something it was desperate to keep buried. She was about to find out what that was, and whether she was ready for the truth. But in this city, where shadows and whispers ruled, one thing was certain. No one could be trusted. The following morning, Lila found herself standing in front of a sleek, glass-fronted building. It was the corporate headquarters of one of the city's most powerful and untouchable figures, Robert Caldwell. A billionaire with a spotless reputation, he was rumored to have ties to every major business in the city. Lila knew that his connection to Jacob Graves could be the key to unraveling the whole mystery. Caldwell's personal assistant, a sharp-dressed woman with cold eyes, led Lila into his office. Robert Caldwell sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his face betraying no emotion. "Detective Harper," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "I hear you're looking into Jacob Graves. What exactly do you hope to find?" Lila met his gaze, her instincts screaming that this man knew more than he let on. Inside Caldwell's office, the walls were lined with expensive art and luxury bookshelves. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Jacob Graves was just a small-time thug, Caldwell said, his voice laced with condescension. If you're looking for anything important, I suggest you look elsewhere. But Lila wasn't fooled. His dismissiveness only strengthened her suspicion. The deeper she probed, the more Caldwell's cool demeanor seemed like a mask. She pressed on, asking about any unusual dealings between him and Jacob. Caldwell's expression stiffened, but he quickly masked it with a well-practiced smile. I don't know why you're wasting your time, he said, but I have nothing to hide. Lila left the office feeling the weight of the man's words, but she was convinced there was something Caldwell wasn't telling her. Lila's frustration grew as she walked out of the building. Caldwell's office had been a dead end, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how calculated his response had been. Something was off. She made her way to the parking garage, her mind racing with new theories. Maybe Caldwell wasn't the target of this investigation. Maybe he was the one pulling the strings. As she approached her car, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A man in a dark suit with cold, calculating eyes. Detective Harper, we need to talk. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I know what you're looking for and I can help you. But if you want the truth, you'll have to trust me. Lila hesitated, but the promise of answers was too tempting. Who are you? She asked. The man's lips curled into a small smile. You'll find out soon enough. The man introduced himself as Julian Gray, a former associate of Jacob Graves, who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. He claimed that Jacob had been working with a powerful criminal syndicate, one that operated in the city's darkest corners. Caldwell is part of something bigger, Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob knew it, but he was trying to get out. That's why he ended up dead. He was getting too close to exposing the truth. Julian handed Lila a small envelope. Inside you'll find the key to understanding everything, but be careful, detective. Once you open this door, there's no turning back. Lila hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of Caldwell, taken years ago, standing beside a man known only to the police as the Ghost, the leader of the criminal syndicate. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She had just uncovered a major lead. Lila sat in her car, the photograph of Caldwell and the Ghost in her hands. It felt like a breakthrough, but a dangerous one. She could sense the gravity of the situation and the weight of the truth she was beginning to uncover. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a message from her partner, Officer Adam Ross. We've got something. You need to come back to the station. Lila felt a knot form in her stomach. The deeper she went, the more it seemed like the city was trying to bury the truth, and the more she realized that she might not be the only one looking for it. As she drove back to the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that the noose was tightening around her. Whatever she was getting into, it was bigger than just Jacob Graves' death, and there was no turning back. Lila arrived at the police station, her mind reeling from the information Julian Gray had given her. The photograph of Caldwell and the Ghost was undeniable proof of a link between the billionaire businessman and the criminal underworld. As she entered the station, Officer Adam Ross met her at the door. We've got a break, he said, his voice low and urgent. He led her to an interrogation room where a man sat, handcuffed and visibly shaken. This is Samuel Cole, Adam explained. He used to work for Caldwell's company. He's willing to talk, but only if we promise him protection. Samuel's eyes darted around the room nervously as Lila sat across from him. I know what you're looking for, Samuel said, his voice trembling. But the truth, it's far more dangerous than you think. Samuel leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Caldwell's not just some businessman, he said, eyes wide with fear. He's been laundering money for years. And Jacob Graves, he knew too much. He was going to blow the whole thing wide open. Lila listened intently, her heart pounding. Samuel's eyes darted to the door, as if he feared someone was watching. "The ghost, he's not just a name," Samuel continued, his voice trembling. "He's a ghost because he's untouchable. But Caldwell, he's the key. Everything leads back to him. Everything." Lila could feel the tension building in the room. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, leaning in. Samuel hesitated, his hands shaking. "Because I know what'll happen if I don't. They'll come for me, like they came for Jacob." Lila left the interrogation room with more questions than answers. Samuel's confession had confirmed much of what she'd suspected, but it also introduced new dangers. Caldwell's involvement in money laundering was just the tip of the iceberg. She had to get to the bottom of it, but she knew that with every answer she uncovered, the stakes grew higher. As she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed again. A message from Adam. "We've got a lead on the ghost." Lila's pulse quickened. She pressed the button for the station's basement, where the most sensitive cases were stored. The ghost's real identity had been a mystery for years, but now, it seemed, they might be closer to uncovering it. As she descended into the darkness of the basement, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into a trap. The basement was cold, the air musty with the scent of old files and forgotten cases. Lila stood before a locked filing cabinet, her heart racing as she unlocked it. Inside, she found a thick folder with the name, "The Ghost," stamped across the front in bold red letters. She flipped through the pages quickly, each one revealing another layer of corruption and deception. There were whispers of a secret deal between Caldwell and several high-ranking officials, but the trail was murky. As she read through the documents, one name kept appearing: Victor Kane. He was the man behind the ghost, the true mastermind. But who was he? Lila knew she had to find him. As she stuffed the folder into her bag, she heard a noise behind her. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. But when she spun around, no one was there. Lila stood frozen for a moment, her senses heightened, but the noise she heard was nothing more than the sound of the old pipes groaning in the walls. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But the unease lingered. She quickly exited the basement, her mind focused on the next step. She needed to find Victor Kane, the ghost, before it was too late. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, the streets slick with water as the city seemed to close in around her. As she climbed into her car, her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Julian Gray. "I know who the ghost is," he said, his voice tense. "Meet me at the old docks. It's time to end this." Lila's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The final confrontation was on the horizon, and she had no idea what awaited her at the docks. Lila drove to the old docks, her headlights cutting through the foggy night. The city had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, and she was no longer sure who could be trusted. As she arrived at the docks, the sound of waves crashing against the rusted ships filled the air, and the smell of salt water mixed with the stench of oil and decay. Julian Gray's silhouette emerged from the shadows, his face tense. "You came," he said, his voice low. Lila didn't say anything, but her eyes searched the area, her instincts telling her to stay alert. "Victor Kane has been hiding here for years," Julian continued. "He's the mastermind behind everything. Caldwell, he's just a pawn." Lila's blood ran cold. She had always suspected Caldwell's involvement, but the extent of the conspiracy was something she hadn't fully understood. Kane was the true power, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. Julian led Lila down a narrow alleyway between two derelict warehouses. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of water slapping against the docks. "Victor Kane is a ghost because he's been carefully crafting a web of lies, manipulating everyone from behind the scenes," Julian explained, his face grim. "Caldwell, the police, even some politicians, they all owe him. The money laundering, the disappearances, it all leads back to him." Lila's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what Julian was saying. She had known that the case was larger than it appeared, but she hadn't realized just how deep it ran. "And where do we find him?" Lila asked, her voice steady, but her heart was pounding. Julian stopped walking, his expression hardening. "He's always a step ahead, but we have a chance now. Kane's meeting someone tonight, and we can catch him off guard. Lila and Julian arrived at a secluded warehouse at the end of the docks. The sound of muffled voices floated from inside, and Lila's heart raced. She motioned for Julian to stay back as she approached the entrance. The door creaked open, and Lila slipped inside. The warehouse was filled with boxes and crates, the air thick with dust. At the far end of the room, she spotted a group of men gathered around a table, one of them unmistakably Victor Kane. He was taller than the others, with cold, calculating eyes. Lila could feel the weight of the moment, the man who had orchestrated everything she had uncovered. Before she could step forward, a man noticed her. "Who's there?" he called out. Kane turned sharply, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's too late, detective," he said, his voice icy. "You've walked into my trap." Tense silence filled the room as Kane's eyes never left Lila. She could feel the danger in the air, the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "You should have stayed out of this, detective," Kane said, his voice calm but dangerous. He motioned for his men to move closer, but Lila didn't flinch. "You've been hiding in the shadows for too long, Kane," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "The truth's out now." Kane chuckled softly. "Truth? There is no truth, only power. And I have all of it." The room seemed to close in around her as Kane's men advanced. But just as things seemed hopeless, Julian burst through the door, gun in hand. "Not so fast," he said, pointing the weapon at Kane. The standoff was on, and Lila knew this was the moment everything would change. The standoff seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound the slow drip of water from the leaky roof above. Lila could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, every nerve on edge. Kane's men were tense, ready to strike, but Lila knew they wouldn't move without Kane's orders. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, Kane smiled, a cold, cruel expression. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You've only uncovered part of the truth, detective. There's so much more you don't know. The city is mine, and nothing you do will change that." Julian stepped forward, his gun still aimed at Kane. "We'll see about that," he said. Just then, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The police were closing in. Kane's face darkened, realizing the game was over. "You may have won today," he sneered, "but there are always more games to play." The warehouse door burst open as the police stormed in, but Kane was already gone, vanishing into the night. The city was waking up, but the night's events still clung to Lila's mind. Kane had slipped through their fingers, and the lead she thought was so solid had evaporated in an instant. Back at the station, Lila reviewed everything she knew. The ghost, Caldwell, the syndicate, and the cryptic messages Kane had left behind. The weight of the investigation was suffocating, but Lila couldn't afford to back down now. She was so close. Just then, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Julian. "I found something. Meet me at the old library in an hour." Lila's heart skipped a beat. Julian had always been reliable, but the timing felt off. Could he have found a breakthrough? Or was this another trap? She had no choice but to find out. Lila arrived at the old library, a massive building nestled in the heart of the city's historic district. It was quiet here, the kind of place where secrets could be buried for years. Julian was waiting for her near the entrance, his posture tense. "I found something that ties Caldwell to Victor Kane," he said, his voice urgent. Lila followed him inside, and Julian led her to a back room filled with old books and records. He handed her a ledger. "This," he said, pointing to a page marked with Caldwell's name, "is the proof. It's a transaction record, but the numbers don't match. This isn't about money, it's a message." Lila turned the pages quickly, her mind racing as she processed the implications. The money laundering was just a smokescreen. The real operation was much darker. As Lila read through the ledger, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Caldwell had been laundering money for Kane, but there was more, much more. The records showed that a portion of the money wasn't going into offshore accounts, but instead to an undisclosed location in the city. A warehouse. the very same one where Lila had confronted Kane earlier. She stood up abruptly, slamming the ledger on the table. The warehouse? It's a storage facility for the syndicate. And it's where they've been hiding the real product. Julian's face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? Drugs, weapons, stolen artifacts, anything that's valuable, Lila said, her voice filled with urgency. Kane's operation isn't just about money. It's about control. We need to hit that warehouse before they move everything out. Lila and Julian rushed to the warehouse. The rain had started again, a torrential downpour that made the streets slick and dangerous. As they arrived, they found the place eerily quiet. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently left in a hurry. Lila motioned for Julian to stay back as she approached the entrance, her hand resting on her gun. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and shadows. The smell of oil and rust filled the air. As they moved deeper, the sounds of muffled voices reached them. Lila's breath caught in her throat. They were close. She rounded a corner, and there, standing at the center of the warehouse, was Caldwell, talking to a group of men. "This is the end of the line," Lila muttered to herself. "I'm ending this tonight." Lila and Julian stormed into the warehouse, guns drawn. "Freeze!" Lila shouted, her voice echoing in the vast space. Caldwell's eyes widened, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you've won," he sneered. "This is just a small part of the bigger picture. You're too late." But before Lila could respond, the door to the warehouse slammed shut, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind her. A dozen men in dark suits emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. Julian grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her to the side. "We've got to move," he said, his voice urgent. They sprinted toward the back door, but Caldwell's men were already blocking the exit. "There's no way out," one of them sneered. Lila's mind raced, but just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The cavalry had arrived. Caldwell's face twisted with rage as the police burst through the doors, guns drawn, taking down his men one by one. The police swarmed the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the chaos that was unfolding. Caldwell stood in the center, surrounded by his men, his face twisted in disbelief. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "This city is mine. You think you've won, you're just pawns in a much bigger game." Lila stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "The game's over, Caldwell," she said, her eyes locked on him. "You're done." Caldwell's expression flickered with something close to fear, but he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. Just then, Julian stepped up beside Lila, his face grim. "We found the evidence. The ghost, the syndicate. It all leads back to you." Caldwell sneered, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're too late, detective. I've already secured my escape." Lila's mind raced as she processed Caldwell's words. He wasn't scared. He was stalling, trying to buy time. But, for what? Suddenly a loud crash interrupted her thoughts. One of Caldwell's men had pulled a gun, and the situation was spiraling out of control. Lila dove behind a stack of crates as gunfire erupted. She could hear the officers returning fire, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the concrete walls. "This isn't over," Caldwell shouted, his voice filled with fury. Lila took cover behind the crates, her heart pounding. She had to end this, and she had to do it fast. "Julian," she yelled. "We need to get to the back room." Julian nodded, his face set with determination. The two of them sprinted across the room, dodging the chaos, moving toward the heart of the operation. The back room was where they could find everything they needed to put Caldwell and the syndicate behind bars for good. As they entered the back room, Lila's heart sank. The walls were lined with stacks of money, drugs, and crates filled with stolen goods. It was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just a money laundering operation. It was a full-scale criminal syndicate. Julian moved toward a desk in the corner, rifling through papers. Lila scanned the room, trying to make sense of everything. Her eyes landed on a black box sitting on the desk. That's it, Julian said, holding up a file. This is what we need. The box contained critical evidence, transaction records, photographs, and a list of people involved in the operation. This was the nail in the coffin. We've got him, Lila said, a surge of relief flooding her chest. But just as they were about to leave, they heard a voice behind them. You're not going anywhere. It was Caldwell, his voice cold and deadly. The game was far from over. Caldwell stepped into the room, a cold smile on his face as he approached Lila and Julian. You think you've won? He sneered, his hand on his gun. You think this is over? You don't understand. This is bigger than just me. This is about control, power, and influence. I own this city. His voice was filled with venom, but beneath it, Lila could hear the desperation. Caldwell was losing his grip on everything. You won't get away with it, Lila said, her voice steady. It's over. You're finished. Caldwell's expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. You're right about one thing, he said, his smile widening. I'm finished. But the truth is you're too late. You don't know what's coming. With those words he made a sudden move for the door, but Julian was faster. He tackled Caldwell to the ground, and the gun clattered to the floor. The game had finally ended. With Caldwell restrained and the evidence in hand, Lila felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The sound of sirens grew louder as police reinforcements stormed the building, securing the perimeter. The chaos in the warehouse had come to an end, and the mastermind behind the syndicate was finally in custody. Caldwell was led away in handcuffs, his arrogant demeanor replaced by frustration and disbelief. Julian stood beside Lila, watching the scene unfold. It's over, he said quietly. Lila nodded, but the relief she felt was tempered by the lingering sense of danger. This operation had been far-reaching, and there were still loose ends to tie up. We've won the battle, she said, her gaze scanning the warehouse one last time. But the war's not over yet. The city would never be the same again. And neither would she. The sun was setting over the city as Lila stood at the edge of the rooftop, looking down at the streets below. The calm, after the storm, was almost surreal. Caldwell's arrest had rocked the city to its core, but as the dust settled, the truth had become clear. The syndicate was far more entrenched than anyone had imagined. The police were scrambling to pick up the pieces, but there was still one question that haunted Lila. What about the ghost? Victor Kane had always been one step ahead, but now he was the only piece left in this dangerous puzzle. Lila's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out. It was a message from Julian. I found something. Meet me at the docks. Lila's heart skipped a beat. The final chapter was about to unfold. The question was no longer if they would catch Kane, but when. Lila arrived at the docks, the salty breeze carrying the faint sound of distant waves crashing against the shore. Julian was waiting by the edge of a pier, looking out at the water. He didn't turn around as she approached. I think I know where Kane is hiding, he said without looking up. There's an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the docks. It's off the radar, but I've been tracking some of Kane's old contacts. This is it. Lila felt a surge of anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The final confrontation. No. Let's end this, she said, her voice steady. As they made their way toward the warehouse, Lila's mind raced. They had already taken down Caldwell, but Kane was the true mastermind behind it all. If they could bring him down, the city might finally get the peace it deserved. As they approached the warehouse, the air grew colder, and the sound of the waves seemed to disappear into the night. Lila's instincts were on high alert. She could feel the tension building, the realization that the endgame was near. They crept through the shadows, moving silently as they neared the entrance. The door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery in the background. Lila's hand instinctively went to her gun as they moved deeper into the building. The shadows seemed to shift, and the silence grew heavier with every step. They were getting closer. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the room. I knew you'd come, detective. Lila froze, her eyes scanning the darkness. Victor Kane had been waiting for them. Victor Kane stepped out of the shadows, his face illuminated by the faint light from the street outside. "You really thought you could stop me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Caldwell, he was a fool. A useful pawn. But you've been a thorn in my side for too long." Lila took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Kane. "It's over, Kane. You've lost." Kane's eyes flickered with something, fear or perhaps anger. "You think you've won? You don't understand the game. This isn't just about money or power. It's about control. And you've walked right into my trap." The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. Lila spun around, her hand going to her gun, but it was too late. Kane's men had surrounded them, weapons drawn. "You're not going anywhere," Kane said, his voice cold as ice. The final battle was about to begin. The standoff seemed to stretch on forever. Lila's mind raced as she assessed the situation. Kane's men were closing in, but she knew there had to be a way out. Just as the tension reached its peak, a loud crash echoed through the room, and the sound of sirens filled the air. Police officers burst through the door, weapons raised. Kane's men froze, momentarily stunned. Lila took her shot, disarming one of the closest men before Julian tackled another to the ground. Kane lunged for the exit, but it was too late. A flash of movement from the shadows. A team of SWAT officers cornered him, guns trained on his chest. "Victor Kane, you're under arrest," one of them shouted. Lila stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, as Kane was cuffed and led away. The syndicate was finally dismantled, and the city was free of the grip that had held it in darkness for so long. But Lila knew this was just the beginning. There were still more battles to fight.